For more than 40 years, Gwen Regalia has been a major player in Walnut Creek politics. She moved to Walnut Creek in 1958. During her political career, she served on the Walnut Creek City Council for 21 years and was mayor 5 times, both records for the city of Walnut Creek. Gwen is a native-born Californian and loves animals and the natural world around us. With her husband Ed, she raised 3 boys and a girl and lived in one of the first subdivisions in Walnut Creek. In 1962, she became active in local government. In 1972, she became a supporter of women's involvement in politics and was instrumental in getting Peg Kovar elected to the Walnut Creek City Council, where she served as the first woman council member in 40 years and as the first female mayor. Gwen was also very active in the creation of the Lesher Center and Walnut Creek Library. Here are some stories and reflections of Gwen's time in Walnut Creek.
Well, my husband and I moved here to Walnut Creek in 1958. We bought a brand new Eichler out in Ignacio Valley, and the city was then about 8,000 people. My husband had just finished law school, and I was a 4th grade teacher at Cragmont School in Berkeley. Our friends were astounded that we would go out to the boonies. To them, it was moving to West Reno, way, way, way far out. But it was an interesting place, and we soon learned a little bit about Walnut Creek. To come into town, you came in on Mount Diablo Boulevard, which ended at Main Street. And then, of course, you could go either way. That was still the main north-south highway, Main Street. We lived off of Ignacio Valley Road, which was a 2-lane road that had exactly 1 traffic signal. That was at Main Street. And going on out into Ignacio Valley, it ended at Oak Grove Road. So that from there you could go to the right and up to Mount Diablo, or you could go left and into Concord, past the Four Corners, Monument Boulevard, etc. The first time I took that drive, I almost fell out of the car, because to drive on Oak Grove in those years was to have orchards on either side, and the branches touched at the top. So it was like driving in a green tunnel. It was really very beautiful. And all of a sudden, I came upon a Shell gasoline station. It was as incongruous as the Mars rover coming upon a Starbucks. What in the world it was doing in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't fathom. But it turned out that Treat Boulevard came over Lime Ridge and ended at Oak Grove Road. And that was the first business on Oak Grove Road. As far as the city itself was concerned, downtown looked pretty much as it does today, the original downtown. Broadway Shopping Center was there, and the big tenants were Sears, which is now Crate and Barrel, Penny's, which is where Neiman Marcus is going now, and Lucky Supermarket, which is where Nordstrom's is. The center had opened in 1951. And Brad Rovenpera and I had agreed that the opening of that center, plus the housing that had come after the end of World War II, had really changed Walnut Creek from an agricultural village to a suburban town. And by the time we came in '58, Capwell's had also been added. That is the larger Macy's store today. So shopping was good, and there were interesting businesses, a lot of them owned by locals. It was a nice place to live, and we were very pleased to be out in the country, so to speak. We were in the city limits, and we were also in Ebmud Water District because the Eichlers had made that deal in order to bring it into the city. From my front window, I had a gorgeous view of Mount Diablo. So we lived there for 15 years. However, the following year after we moved in, my first child was born, and I became a stay-at-home mom. When he was 1 month old, I joined the American Association of University Women. Needed to do something outside the house. And that really got me involved in the community. From there, I became involved in both partisan and nonpartisan politics. Had the 1960 election in my garage. Worked in my first city council campaign in 1962. Made a lot of friends in the area, both Democrat and Republican friends, and worked in a number of campaigns. So began to hone the skills of how do you get good people into office. However, I was also busy at home because within 3 years and 2 months I had 3 little boys. So I did have a few things to take care of there. When we moved in, across the street from us was a walnut orchard. We knew it was to be a school, and indeed in 1960, San Miguel School was built by the Mount Diablo School District. I had a rare day away with a group of women. We went to a nice luncheon down the peninsula, and when I came home, all the walnut trees were down, except for one row behind the houses on San Benito Drive. Well, I couldn't believe it. We'd been told by the salesman, of course in those days you believed people like that it would be just like Walnut Acres School, where they had left much of the walnut orchard standing. Well, I immediately got in touch with the superintendent of Mount Diablo School District, and they left those trees, and I was soon appointed chair of the landscape committee. So working with the homeowners and other interested people, we did help to landscape the school. And I was then contacted by Ruth Wallace, who at the time was the recreation director for the city of Walnut Creek. The city was looking to jointly use the field that was being built at the school, and asked me if I would make the presentation to the Mount Diablo School Board. So I did, my first civic involvement really, and that was the beginning of the joint powers agreements that the city worked out with many of the schools, most of the schools, I guess. 1972, the women's movement had come as far as Walnut Creek, and there were groups here that were very involved. The League of Women Voters, American Association of University Women now had begun. National Women's Political Caucus was getting started. And there were practically no women serving in any elected office anywhere in Contra Costa County. It was okay to have a woman, maybe 2, on a school board, and that there seemed to be some affinity for women, children, and education. But city councils, my goodness. In all of Contra Costa, I think there may have been 3 women serving on city councils. In early 1972, I remember having a meeting at my house, and I don't remember particularly what it was called for. It could have been just a group of gals and husbands getting together and visiting, which we did periodically. And the discussion got around to the coming Walnut Creek City Council election, which was to be in April of that year. So we started talking about, gee, we ought to have a woman run. We really need a woman candidate. So we discussed a number of people, and the name Peg Kovar kept emerging. And finally, the group said, look, let's see if she would be willing to run for office. And Gwen, you're appointed to call her. Well, I had met Peg, but we were sort of casual acquaintances. We both had been involved in a number of things within the community. I particularly with the Kennedy King Memorial College Scholarship Foundation, which was started in 1968. And my husband and I are both founding members and still active in that. And so I'd been doing a lot of speaking on behalf of that in the community, and I'd also, as I said, been involved in some other activities as well. So I had met Peg through one or more of these activities. So I called her, and the first thing we had to determine was, did she live in the city? She lived off of Homestead, and you know, the city boundaries wander in and out of this town. It looked like they'd been drawn by somebody who'd had a few too many martinis, and they just continue to in and out. So indeed, she lived in the city. And next question, would she consider running for the city council? And she said to me, Gwen, why don't you run? And I said, oh, I can. I have a 4-year-old. And she said, well, so do I. Next, I said, well, I don't know that I'd be really that interested in running for, or even serving on a city council, but you'd be perfect. As the League of Women Voters person, she had been observing the council meetings for some time to report back to the League. She was aware of the people involved. She was aware of the issues involved. She was aware of what was going on in the city far more than I. So finally she said she'd think about it and get back to me. So she got back to me and said yes, she would do it. So I immediately called my friend Lillian Bernstein. She and I had worked together on a number of campaigns, and the three of us sat down and mapped out what we were going to do. And we were going to rely on a lot of women, and we all had friends and people who had worked in previous campaigns who lived in the city who would be happy to see a woman candidate. And so we decided on our strategy, which was to start out by having coffees in various neighborhoods. We ended up having 70 coffees. We had dedicated volunteers. Our bumper strips are all hand-screened. Some of our clever volunteers painted signs for us. We had a couple of big 8 by 10 foot plywood signs. Somebody had donated the plywood. They were hand-painted. One of them went up on Sign Hill, Ignacio Valley Road in Homestead, you know where all the signs go up during campaigns, and it disappeared before the election. Somebody was angry, I guess, and took it down. After Peg was actually elected, it reappeared one day. I guess they didn't like her vote. So she called the city public works to take it down and keep the sign and use it for some useful purpose in the city. And she was truly interested in good city planning. BART had come to town. It had opened in 1973 or 74 here. And one of the reasons all of those big buildings are there is this is what we're looking at in terms of better city planning. Instead of sprawling all over the place with low-rise buildings, is to put larger buildings together at a hub of transportation. And certainly that was it. The freeway had been completed. It was being built in the 60s, had been completed. There was an off-ramp at Ignacio Valley. It was an ideal place to put large buildings, and many companies moved out from San Francisco and Oakland to occupy them. Also, many companies here decided to locate there. So though a lot of people didn't like the fact that Walnut Creek was changing, it was, in effect, good planning. Walnut Creek, however, had not abated. I was still interested in what went on with the city, and the number of things had been going on. However, there was a group that had come together and basically, out of nostalgia, did not like the fact that Walnut Creek was a changing city. Those large buildings really, I guess, set their teeth on edge. Although, interestingly enough, the same people who were opposed now to those big buildings were among the same people who had sat in meetings at the city council over the years and said nothing as they came before the various commissions and city council. So they later said nobody listened, they weren't listened to. They didn't speak up when all of that was coming before the city. However, they did launch a campaign, and a group of people did get together, and their first effort was height limitation and to stop second units. Second units being added onto your house and making a granny unit or an apartment that you might rent. Those are allowed under city law and under state law, and they were trying to stop this practice. That failed at the polls. But their second measure, height limitation, succeeded, and in fact is still on the books. What they did was knock back what had been 8-story buildings to no taller than 6 stories. There were apparently only 2 parcels left in Walnut Creek that would have had that high a building. And then they locked in the height limits that were in the then current general plan, which is why there was the 20-foot height limit at the old co-op site and why it sat abandoned for some 35 years. So that remained. Their next issue was Measure H, which they were selling as a traffic control measure. It was not really a traffic control measure. It was a growth limitation measure, and it would lead to, again, sprawling out rather than going up when you are a city. They said, "Do you like all this traffic on Ignacio Valley?" "No, sign here." They then used that in the campaign. It was to stop traffic until it could meet certain levels on Ignacio Valley Road. Growth in the city would be limited. Now, that may be a way to go about doing something. The problem is we had no control over the traffic. That is a state-sanctioned road, is actually a freeway, the unbuilt freeway. And the traffic that impacts Ignacio Valley Road comes over the Kirker Pass, Antioch, Pittsburgh, Brentwood, etc. And it's been proved time and again when there's been a traffic accident in the morning on Kirker Pass, Ignacio Valley is free-flowing, meaning it can take the traffic from Walnut Creek, Concord, and Clayton, interestingly. But it can't, it gets impacted as traffic comes over the hill on Kirker Pass. So that was Measure H. It passed by a few, I think it was something like 400 votes. It was not a landslide. It was a victory, but not a tremendous victory. It was a fairly toss-up event, but it became the law of Walnut Creek. I was opposed to Measure H because I thought if they wanted to make change, they should go through a public process. The problem with an initiative is it's written by a few group of people expressing their point of view, and they have the right to do it. I'm not objecting to that. But there is no public understanding of what's in that measure. It doesn't go through a process where they have to explain and other people have the opportunity to be heard. It can have great impacts that are maybe intended, maybe unintended, that are not evaluated. That's my problem with many initiatives. So it became the law, and Walnut Creek began to cope with it. As I say, I ran in that campaign in 1985. I did not make it. I lost by about the same number of votes as Measure H passed by, and I had just closed a school, which is not a popular thing to do when you're a candidate for anything. So I remained on the school board, but I continued my interest in what was going on here in the city. And I ran the next time in 1987. This time, 11 candidates. I seem to have something about 11. This time I was elected. There were 3 seats up. Gail Murray was the incumbent and took top place. I came in second, and Matt Madsen came in third, who became the third vote on the council for the Measure H supporting people.
Here.
Mrs. Murray?
Here.
Mrs. Regalia?
Here.
Mrs.
I never intended to set a record, but it ended up I did. I have served longer than anybody else on the Walnut Creek City Council, some 21 years, and the only person who's been mayor 5 times. Each time it was time to run for re-election, there was something of importance going on, and I decided to run again. So I had a very interesting time on the council, and as I said, when I retired, the bookends of my career here were actually arts and culture. It's not long after I was elected, I voted to build the Regional Center for the Arts, today called the Lesher Center. And before I retired, I had voted to build the new Walnut Creek Library. I'd been here in 1961 when that library opened, and it seemed huge. My goodness, it was a vast expanse. But as you know, it had certainly filled up. The city had changed. We had grown. We'd become what is called an edge city, no longer just a little suburban town. We were the center of commerce for central Contra Costa County, a very different place. The housing had pretty well, in terms of housing tracts, had pretty well been over by the 1980s. The last one that was approved and built was Rancho Paraiso. So housing had now changed as well, and we were seeing more infill development, small houses, small groups of maybe half a dozen homes or condominiums, townhouses, that type of thing. So that went on all during my years. We did try, even after the Measure H people had pretty well been unelected from the council, in other words, not returned to their seats, had put together a big study of what does the community wish in terms of growth and development, keeping in mind that we are no longer an agricultural village. And should there be some mechanism to control some of the growth that was going on in Walnut Creek? And indeed we did, with the new general plan. That rations how much can be built in a year in terms of commercial development. However, we're smart enough to understand that the economy plays a big role in this. We have no control over what the economy is going to do. When is money available to provide new buildings? When is it not? And so we did allow the unused square footage to roll over into the next time period if necessary. And so there were times when there was a lot of development going on within the city all at once, something we had tried to parcel out, but it's impossible to do completely. I also had the opportunity to participate in many other aspects of life in Walnut Creek. During the time I was on the council, we added 305 acres of open space to our original. The most of almost any, I think Palo Alto has more, but theirs is not in Palo Alto. Ours is in our own city. I helped to see that 2 gymnasiums were built, helped to see the development of several parks, including Arbolado, which is a huge park, Walden, that had been land banked for some time, Tice Park. But Heather Farm itself came into being in the 60s. Lytton Savings at that time owned what was then most of Heather Farm, not all of it, but a good deal of it. My husband was their attorney. And when the bond issue, they had intended to put in an 18-hole golf course. 9 holes were ultimately built, and they got the zoning for the condominium projects that went in. They were both condominiums and apartments, in exchange for which they would give up the lower 9 golf course, which became Heather Farm Park. And it was purchased with funds from that bond issue, and also apparently with money that had come from the Johnson administration, the Great Society, in helping to put people to work. So that was the beginning of Heather Farm. Now the Bancrofts also owned property there, and they donated some of it to the city. They also donated what became the fields in the front to the Mount Diablo School District, expecting that another elementary school would have to be built. Well, the property just sat there for a very long time. And finally, in the 90s, and I'm sorry I've forgotten the year, the city purchased that property from the Mount Diablo School District with the permission of Mrs. Bancroft. She realized that it would be good to incorporate it into the park, that the school district was not going to be needing an elementary school. And so it was another of the, in effect, generous gifts that the Bancrofts made to the city over the years. They truly have been very generous. And they, I believe, donated some of the land in the back that had been theirs to create Heather Farm. So the rebuild then that went forward was to take this property and to put in the playing fields that exist there now, to have a better system of running the park, and not running the park, but seeing that it was being used to its biggest advantage. Redid the children's playground, and worked on the lake and the 2 lakes. One is the natural and the other is the man-made. Tried to do their best to protect the waterfowl, et cetera, that were there. And also, later, we used a piece of the front portion for a skate park, and that was late, after, I guess, 2000 that went in. John Muir Hospital came into being when a group of doctors here in Walnut Creek wanted a hospital, I don't want to say of their own, but a community hospital in Walnut Creek. At the time, Kaiser was operating, and for a while they allowed non-Kaiser doctors to use it, and then they stopped that policy as their membership was growing. So the doctors had a choice of going to Mount Diablo or into Berkeley and Oakland to take their patients, and they really wanted a place close to home. So a group of them went together and bought this property on La Casa Villa. Well, La Casa Villa at the time was a group of ranches, and the Lawrence Brother Meat Company had their slaughterhouse up there. The first hospital building was the tall building that is still standing, will be torn down apparently in the next few years, but it was then built in the early 60s. And then it had became as the city grew, The population grew, they needed more space, and I think from the time I was first elected to the city council until the day I left, John Muir was on the agenda, you know, for something. And they went through a number of plans. They ended up expanding quite a bit. They purchased a lot of property there for the hospital's use. So I have to say, I think the spirit of cooperation, which is what I have always been about. You may say that, oh, well, the council, you know, just rubber stamps everything. It's not true. We have worked together in a cooperative manner. We have tried to follow the issues. We try to listen to people. Everyone is not going to get what they want or would like, but that's how things go. You do your best to resolve the problems that you're presented with in a way that is reasonable, in a way that benefits the largest number of people. You don't do it to benefit yourself. You do it to benefit the community. And I think that's what has been so wonderful for me serving in this capacity, is that attitude that has certainly been here in this city. And it has been a real honor to serve it.